The sea was calm, and the cameras were hungry. Lights strung along the yacht's rail trembled like captive stars. Crystal glasses caught the wash of champagne and threw it back in little explosions. Conversation moved in practiced currents, polite compliments, precise laughter, the kind of words that would later read like invoices, pleasant, payable, neutral. Wanjo stood at the stern with one hand on the rail and the other on the little locket she kept for Shawan. The locket warmed in her palm as if the metal still remembered a child's tiny hand. Everything on a night like that was a performance of plenty. The Sioux name paid for the performance. People donated their smiles to it. There were photographers on the rail, industry paparazzi by habit, hired lenses by arrangement, and a bank of phones like a congregation offering benediction. Cameras angled for the familiar tableau, the patriarch making a joke, the heir laughing, the families arranging themselves into the arranged geometry of status. The yacht smelled of citrus cleaner, sunscreen, expensive cologne. Under the lights, Wanjo's white dress softened her grief into acceptable sorrow, a widow of a different sort, a woman who had learned how to carry absence with a posture that read as dignity. She had not expected to be found out. The photograph that would become a verdict began as an accident of light. A flash caught Wanjo leaning too close to a man whose face, at the moment of capture, was turned away. The frame registered the tilt of her head, the way a hand rested at the small of someone else's back. An ambiguous, arrested domesticity, enough for a headline. The picture traveled thin wires faster than rumors. By morning it had teeth, a crop here, a caption there, an editor's scrawl that traded nuance for certainty. The online translation of the image, 100 characters, 300 words, 1,000 outraged reposts, meant judgment without hearing. In a world where optics often suffice for evidence, the image proved persuasive. The family notice followed with the efficiency of a corporate memo, a statement of regret, a distancing clause performed with all the elegance of a house selling off a room full of furniture. Old Master Sioux called it a rupture of trust. His voice, calibrated for broadcast humiliation, said things meant to be imprinted on every business contact list and social calendar. There would be no official defense. There would be an announcement of temporary withdrawal from public functions. The heir's PR team would manage the fallout. Wanjo would not be seen at charity luncheons or fundraisers. Her suite at the family residence would be winterized and offered to visiting dignitaries. In that hour, the photograph did what no private grief could. It stripped her of the soft currency of reputation. They dressed the exile like a kindness. They boxed her belongings with white gloves and labeled each parcel with pragmatic precision.
Wanjo signed an inventory she could not read without anger. The ring she had been wearing, thin, compromised by loss and memory, was removed from her finger by a gloved hand and placed in a felt-lined box labeled returnable personal effects. She watched them cart away the things that marked her belonging, the plates with the family crest, the photographs that included the ever-smiling Sioux men, the drawer of handwritten notes from her husband. They left her one black suitcase and a Monday morning apartment in the city, a manageable penalty delivered with corporate efficiency. That night, she sat on the low couch of the apartment and opened the locket. Shawan's photograph was a small proof of what she had lost and could not be allowed to show. The locket slipped between her fingers like a coin that no market would accept. Outside, a cab took a senator home. Inside, the TV looped an anchor's clipped empathy and a pundit's appetite for scandal. Wanjo had become a story with certain margins. The grief gathered around her like a habit she had no license to abandon. She walked the city in a dress that seemed to make her smaller. The crowds were conveniences, anonymous currents that let her move without commentary. Once she stopped at a tea stall and let a vendor fix her a paper cup of jasmine. Steam fogged the cup like a transient fog across an identity. She looked down at her hands and watched the small tremor she had not permitted to anyone. The ring was abroad in someone else's drawer. She kept checking her finger as if the finger itself might be the evidence of wrong. Her exile lasted in degrees. Public absence, private observation. Invitations ceased. The charity newsletters no longer printed her name. Vendors stopped calling to ask if she needed an event planner. Emails, those quiet, potent documents of social life, moved into a folder marked archived relationship. The city began to teach her how to pass through rooms without being the room's interesting thing. On the third week, a business card arrived on the table of the small cafe where she had come to be invisible. It was the kind of thing placed with intention, just the edge of a card poking out from under a salt-stained menu like someone had left a private signal. Uncle Lee's hand seemed to know exactly how to place opportunities. His name was punctual and plain. His message, contained within, was not. He did not offer petty. He offered a phone number and a sentence. There was a ledger that does not live by public rumor. The sentence implied a way of measuring damage by other standards, a ledger as remedy. He knew hunger disguised as curiosity, and he knew the exact temperature needed to make Wanjo listen. Do not be seen, come alone, find out how the world keeps accounts. She did not go to him immediately. That was not her way. For days, Wanjo folded the card into the pages of a church program she kept for the Christage.
Nightly, she opened and closed the locket, a ritual that read like prayer without words. The city, for all its busyness, kept her small, her movements cautious as a swimmer learning to trust a damaged knee. Yet grief, when it does not kill, breeds a narrow kind of hunger. It sharpens the faculties that vanity once dulled. Wanjo began to notice patterns she had never had to look for, the way invoices repeated a name, how manifests left faint traces in the margins, the little bureaucratic scaffolding that held reputations upright. Uncle Lee met her at a restaurant that perched over a quiet side street, a place where light pooled in deliberate squares, and the clink of glass was a private grammar. He drank slowly. His face had the honest wear of someone who had been in the room where deals were made and had learned to keep his mouth shaped for usefulness. "There are things that will not be solved by apologies," he said, as if saying anything else would be indulgent. "There are instruments, ledgers, receipts, a port manifest that contradicts a public story. The law needs paper. The market needs consistency. If you understand those, you can make the market honest." Wanjo listened more to the movement of his hands than to his actual words. She had always been good at learning the curriculum of the room she inherited, how to bend a smile, how to place a compliment. This offer was different. It proposed an education in the machinery that kept the city's reputations recognizable, an apprenticeship not in speech but in record. "If I wanted to be unexiled," Wanjo asked, "would I have to behave like I never left?" "Not behave," Uncle Lee corrected quietly. "Recreate the ledger that proves you were never as absent as they think. Show them that the instruments they trust can be read differently. The law has patience. It will take time, and it will ask for evidence. It will ask for witnesses. It will require that you learn how to ask for subpoenas like a musician asks for tempo." Learning, Wanjo thought, could be a form of living. She had been poor at not being the center of the room. She had been better at being a particular kind of paper in other people's hands. The idea of reading ledgers, of seeing where signatures landed, where shipments went missing, where numbers were misallocated, felt like an anatomy lesson in authority. When he spoke of manifests and port entries, Wanjo felt a curiosity like thirst. It was more practical than vengeance. It might heal or it might not. It would at least name the thing she had learned to carry without permission. Uncle Lee was not a recruiter in the theatrical sense. He was a connector. He made arrangements and kept conversations off record. What he could not provide were the resources she would need to make a dossier: access, money, discretion. For that, he suggested the only person he trusted in a city built on discretion, Fu Yuanshen. Fu's name had weight. He was an enigma who moved in the shadows of legitimate power, a consortium leader who kept strict hours, who invested in infrastructure and in silence. People talked about him the way people described storms, by the damage left in their wake, not by the weather itself. The first time Wanjo saw him, she thought of a clock in a courtroom, precise and cool, measuring out moments with a face that betrayed nothing. They met because arrangements can be made quickly when people have motives that line up. Fu found her at a small table, a plate of vegetables left nearly untouched. He wore navy and a watch that did not need conversation. When he spoke, his voice had the evenness of someone who had watched many people finish their sentences for them. "I am not here to replace what you've lost," he said, "not to be consolation. Consolation is a poor currency. I have networks the public does not imagine. I have contacts in logistics and an interest in order. If you can read a ledger, and if you are willing to learn what to look for, you could do what the law will not do alone." Wanjo's first reaction was suspicion. Men like Fu were often the villains in the quiet parts of wealth, the ones who orchestrated transactions like chess moves. But he did not speak with the arrogance she expected. He offered resources but no promises. He spoke in terms of mechanics, manifests, port receipts, chain of custody. He offered Chi-Chi, a woman of few words who could sit at a desk and transform a stack of paper into a map. He offered Young, the investigator, someone whose specialty was following the logic of logistics until the logic gave way. He offered, in short, a method. There was an economy to his manner that looked a lot like steadiness. That steadiness had its own seduction. Wanjo understood why people sought out such constancy in storms. It was the same reason survivors sat by campfires telling their stories. Having someone who did not flinch at the facts felt like a shore. "Why me?" she asked. "I'm hardly the most discreet candidate."
"You are public enough that your case matters," Fu replied, "and private enough that you have reasons others do not." He did not ask the name of Shawan. He did not demand why Wanjo had been exiled. He treated grief as a fact to be respected, not a spectacle to be folded into argument. That restraint was part of the lure. It suggested that he might be a harbor rather than a storm. A first lesson arrived the day she returned to the yacht to collect a few personal effects under supervision. They had allowed her a measured hour to retrieve items they deemed sentimental. It was bureaucratic mercy, a performance of closure. Wanjo went back to the place where the scandal had been born, and the sea was the same indifferent blue. The yacht smelled of lemon oil and a faint memory of cologne. Her cabin was orderly and clinical, the cushions fluffed as if nothing had been stained in its fabric.
She opened the dressing room to take the mirror larger than any she had in her new apartment. It was one of those mirrors with a small hinge on the lower board, a carpenter's solution for a cramped room. Something about the way it had been mounted had always felt like a secret. She touched the edge of the frame, as if confirming a suspicion you only test to avoid surprising yourself. Her fingers found a seam and the board gave way. Behind the mirror, folded like a private prayer, was a piece of paper she did not recognize, a port receipt with a stamped date and a scrawl that matched the old master's firm's signature. The receipt listed a manifest number and an address that connected in her mind, with the slow certainty of a tide, to warehouses she had passed while in exile. It was not an accusation by itself. It was paper that refused to lie. It named shipments, dates, and a ledger entry that tied back to the very networks the Sioux house used. Whoever had tucked that paper there had been either careless in their concealment or cunning enough to suppose a woman exiled would never look. Holding the paper felt like holding a lever. Paper had weight she had always underestimated, its ability to make private things public, its capacity to call names and assign responsibility. Wanjo pressed the receipt into the inside of her coat and folded the mirror back almost reverently, as if she returned an altar to its place. The discovery did not give her immediate relief, it gave her a direction. She met Fu again in a neutral room that smelled of brewing coffee and newspapers. They were careful about places. Discretion was a practiced habit. Young, taciturn, and precise, arrived with him and introduced himself with an economist's economy. Chi-Chi observed from a distance whose distance was so deliberate it made everything else elastic. Together they showed her the work with a coolness that had something like mercy. Small delays, Young said, can accumulate into meaningful losses for a family conglomerate. Container misdirection, falsified manifests, these are not glamorous things, but they are truthful. Chi-Chi laid out an example on a tablet, a shipment listed and then not matching the customs registry, a set of invoices whose numbers were off by a digit that linked to a different shipping line. The proof was rarely an instant revelation. A ledger spoke in murmurings. It required patient listening. "Do you understand subpoenas?" Fu asked finally. He asked not to test her knowledge, but to measure the distance between her current skill set and the one she would need. They are instruments, they are not magic. They will take time and they will be resisted, but they will demand an answer. Where is the shipment? Who signed for it? Who was present at unloading? Paper makes the wall of fact. You learn to read where it is porous. Wanjo tasted the possibility of agency. It was not an easy sweetness. It suggested work without guarantees. It suggested sacrifice. It suggested that to call a thing by its ledger name was to invite the ledger to name you in return. She thought of the locket and the way her fingers had trembled when she held it. She thought also of the photograph, how a single moment of light had rearranged an entire life. The ledger, she saw, might allow her to rearrange light in a different way. There was a kindness that slid sideways into their conversation, an offer of partnership that was not sentimental but calculated. Fu spoke of resources, introductions, and the skill to make a dossier hold. He did not speak of love, not yet, and yet the manner of his offers contained an intimacy. He offered to teach her to weaponize the non-violent instruments of the world, subpoenas, manifests, testimonies. He made the study of paperwork sound like a return to order, a way to make the world answerable. She asked about risk. Old Master Su did not make enemies without capacity for counterattack. Wanjo watched Fu's face for an answer that held either bravado or honesty. He offered the latter. He can attack you, Fu said. He can use social avenue, legal avenue, the private armory that a family network holds. He can make your life uncomfortable, but he cannot unmake facts. He cannot erase manifests. He cannot, if we compile them correctly, prevent a commission from asking uncomfortable questions.
It was a methodical form of revenge that felt like the right kind of thing to cultivate. Official, plodding, lethal in its patience. Wanjo did not want a melodramatic ruin. She wanted a ledger that could be read by people who knew the grammar of commerce. She wanted the law to do what the cameras could not. Take time to count, to cross-check, to hold witnesses under oath. On the night she accepted, the city had rained and the apartment smelled of wet stone. She sat at the small table and placed the port receipt in front of her like a small confession. The paper did not glitter. It simply was. She felt the shift before she could name it. The idea that she might turn the machinery that had once protected a family into a kind of mirror that reflected its deceptions. It promised a return not as spectacle, but as process. It offered a way back through calculation, not apology. She called Uncle Lee and asked him to give word of her willingness. He came the next morning, not pleased but not surprised. He handed her a small manila envelope, a list of names, a map of ports, an address scrawled in a handwriting that belonged to a man who thought numbers should behave like people, predictable and accountable. He offered two kinds of help: introductions and silence. Silence, he made clear, was a commodity as precious as money. The first weeks of learning were deliberate and lenient. Wanjo spent mornings at a small office where Chi-Chi taught her the vocabulary of logistics: manifest numbers, bill of lading, container IDs. She learned to read the way a ledger tracked the city's circulation of goods and favors.
The terms sounded like an incantation at first. She pronounced them aloud, as one practices the alphabet of a new country. In afternoons, she shadowed Young as he interviewed a clerk at a port terminal. The clerk's hands remembered the boxes, and his testimony had the slowness of someone who had been asked to memorize life in the margin. It was not a dramatic exchange. It was a series of small admissions that, when stitched together, suggested pattern. Those stitches were fragile. They required patience on Wanjo's side and carefulness on Young. Each small confession felt like a stolen breath for a woman who had been taught to make her life photogenic above all else. Between lessons, Wanjo found herself increasingly aware of Fu's presence. He moved through their operation like a current, unshowy, decisive. He did not offer grand declarations. He offered attention in small forms. A report arrived with precise notations, a phone call that left a schedule in her palm like a promise of order. She felt the particular comfort of being matched to someone who treated facts as sacred. That comfort had its own gravity. Desire began, as desire often does, as a refuge. It was not thunderclap romanticism. It was a steady warmth in the chest that made her less inclined to tremble. She started to rely on the clarity of his attention. In rooms where everyone else spoke in the fog of status, his questions were like flares. They cut the air. He read the ledger with a surgeon's patience, never flurried, never condescending. Someone who could sit quietly and make sense of noise was, to Wanjo in those early weeks, a kind of company. It would be dishonest to claim she did not notice the way his restraint had a pull. When a man is steady in a world of performative certainty, his steadiness becomes currency. A touch of the hand on a folder became more than a touch. The late-night review of manifests turned into a private ritual. Lights low, the smell of printer ink, the stack of receipts between them. They would speak in small, practical observations, and Wanjo would leave the room with a little less shaking in her limbs. But the work required boundaries. Young taught her to compartmentalize evidence, where receipts belonged, how witnesses should be arranged. Chi-Chi reminded her, with a look that was not kinder than necessary, that personal soft spots were vulnerabilities to be guarded. There was a theater to the discipline. The valence of being strategic meant keeping personal longings discreet. Wanjo nodded, practiced the pose of restraint, and then found that
She felt, for the first time in months, an odd compound of rage and clarity. Grief turned into arithmetic. That arithmetic would become a kind of faith. She found herself hungry for details. She wanted to know what a manifest looked like when it had been manipulated, how signatures could be traced to particular hands, where a port's loggers archived their records, and how a fastidious official might trap a lie in a web of dates and locations. Each lesson was a remedy and a lure. She was learning not just how to ask for subpoenas, but how to imagine the world in terms of evidence. Still, the photograph haunted her like an itch. It had the texture of a verdict. People had seen her in a compromised frame and had assigned meaning to a single moment. She had learned, privately, that the camera could be cruelly efficient, but the ledger was patient.
She would need both patience and ferocity in the measured ways her new teachers demanded. A shift, small and nearly imperceptible, began to mark her days. She checked for messages from Fu the way she had once checked social columns for invitations. She found herself replaying his spare sentences, not as love notes but as blueprints. When the workforce of our days shifts its center, affection can arrive disguised as method. Wanjo noticed she wanted his approval more than she wanted the public's pity. Where once she had lived by the currency of applause, now she measured her days by a quieter reckonings, extraction of facts, the filing of documents, the small triumph of making a manifest admit it had lied. There were nights she woke with the locket open and thought of Xiaoan's laugh as if it were a currency to be invested. She would tell herself she was not telling secrets to anyone, that the warmth she found in Fu's steadiness was an engine, not a trap. But attachment has its ways of growing where one least expects it. It begins by being useful and ends by being claimed. Her first minor success was a shipment that failed to appear on a receiving dock. It was a victory that tasted like cold coffee and the satisfaction of a well-pulled thread. The misdirection revealed a chain between a shell company and a warehouse whose registries bore the imprint of the old master's name. Young's interviews had been patient, and Chi-Chi's notes precise. They had collected testimony that matched the port receipt Wanjo had found. The match was not an indictment in itself, it was a crack. It suggested that the elegant body of the corporation might have a tremor. The newspapers for a day reduced the incident to a paragraph buried under other people's scandals. Wanjo kept her face still, but inside she carried the ledger like a map. The feeling of competence that rose within her was not entirely sweet. With each small victory she felt the subtle press of dependency, the little rush when Fu approved a plan, the slight dullness when she operated without him.
She told herself she would not make her solace a necessity, that she would not trade the one kind of public validation for a private one. Still, the pattern unfurled. On an ordinary afternoon, as Wanjo arranged receipts in the small office Chi-Chi had given her, a man named Pierce Hargrave reached out. He called himself a concerned party with knowledge, an ex-insider, he said, who had watched transactions pass through the channels that served families like Su and Meng. He did not sound theatrical. He sounded like a man who had run out of clean places to put his secrets. His name appeared threaded through Chi-Chi's roster of potential witnesses. The possibility of his testimony was not a solution, it was a hinge. The work that became a communal effort had moments of private tenderness. Fu would sometimes pause beside Wanjo's seat, his presence quiet and deliberate, and they would both look at a set of figures as if they were looking at a painting. Those moments were a kind of language, an exchange of attention that required no contract. They were also a risk. Wanjo recognized that reliance can be a sluice. It lets certain currents through and blocks others. She began guarding half the ledger with a new attention, preserving what was for the case and what must remain unread by the public and by the family. When the first hostile letter arrived at her small apartment, unsigned and threatening, it felt like a predictable escalation. It arrived the day after a minor exposé questioned the provenance of a transportation contract. Wanjo read it with Chi-Chi and Young nearby. The letter did not make claims it could not back up. It used insinuation like a test. The words were clinical. It meant to warn. Wanjo folded it and placed it in the back of a drawer behind the locket. She did not show Fu immediately. She wanted him to see only the dossier, facts that could be turned into process. He learned of it because threats have the awkward habit of becoming done. A senior counsel called. The Su house had retained lawyers. Papers would be filed. There would be public statements about unfounded allegations and malicious campaigns. The old master had the resources to make recourse expensive and social pressure a practical tool. Wanjo understood the geography of a powerful family's defensive reach. She had grown up with the knowledge that wealth extended like a territory and was policed by etiquette as much as by hired agents. Fu's answer to the aggression was not counter-threat, but machinery. He suggested cataloging everything, building a chain of custody, getting the receipts into a safer archive. Make a ledger that requires translation, he said. If they wish to attack, they will have to choose between contesting facts under oath or painting themselves into more paper. There was a cold elegance to the approach. It did not promise immediate safety. It promised process.
The more Wanjo moved inside the ledger's logic, the more the photograph's pressure softened into a different instrument of memory. That did not mean the photograph lost power. The city still saw her through that single ill-lit frame. People still whispered. But the ledger was a counter-image, detailed, slow, and hard to smear with rumor. Then, in a late afternoon when light fell across the office like a practiced accusation, Fu left a small note on Wanjo's desk. It was not a love note. It was a time to meet and a list of documents he wanted examined. The handwriting was neat and spare. She read it twice. In the margin, in ink that suggested care where a man might otherwise show calculation, he had written one word: steady. A human call for steadiness is not a defense against dependency, she thought. It can be a balm. It can be a brace. It can also become a need. She put the note inside the locket for a moment, as if to keep that proof of steadiness with Shaoan. Then she replaced the locket in the drawer with the port receipt, laying them like cross-references. The sea had been calm on the night that started all of this. The water had lent a sort of mercy to the memory that was both cruel and serene. Wanjo had been thrown off a public ledger by a single image. Now she was learning how to rewrite the bookkeeping of a reputation, one receipt at a time. Her resolve had the hard edge of someone who knows the cost in advance. She had signed, in a sense, for a life of patience. The apprenticeship with Fu was a way forward, not through spectacle, but through evidence. She would learn the rules, file the documents, marshal the witnesses. In doing so, she would unmake a kind of certainty the photograph had created. Yet in the quiet hours she felt another accounting taking shape, one unlisted on any manifesto. It was an internal tally that counted not only victories but attachments, the slow accrual of reliance on a man who offered order like a harbor. Desire had begun as refuge. It was shaping, almost imperceptibly, into something that could ask for more. A day came when Wanjo had to decide whether to give a statement to a trade investigator who had called with a cautious official tone. The investigator's questions were precise and unromantic: dates, locations, items. Wanjo answered with care. Each sentence was a small exercise in conviction. Afterward, as she folded the port receipt and placed it back behind the mirror board she had kept, she felt the ledger's gravity and another, more personal gravity pulling in a direction she did not yet name. She had not yet taken any public action. There were no grand revelations, no airings of familial shame in headlines that would produce instant justice. There was only paper, quiet, patient, implacable. There was the slow strategy of evidence. There was Fu, whose manner was both aid and temptation. There was Uncle Lee's card, placed like an understatement of possibility on her kitchen table.
There was the locket, a private proof that had not yet been called to cross-examination. If you love slow-burn social thrillers, subscribe. That evening, Wanjo sat by the window and watched the river move in a direction she could not change. A ferry cut through the black like a ledger entry, leaving ripples that bent and reformed in the lamplight. The photograph had given the world an image of her that could be circulated without context. The receipt, found in the seam behind a mirror, offered a different kind of thing, a question to be answered by facts rather than by crowdsourced outrage. She was beginning to build a dossier, not for vengeance as celebrity theater, but for procedure. She wanted the machinery of the city to declare on paper what the photograph had only insinuated. It was a slow satisfaction. It would require that she learn how to be patient with the law's cadences. She also felt the thrum of another mechanism, attachment to the man who had taught her to see in ledgers. The warmth that had first felt like refuge began to color decisions. She checked herself when she called him. She catalogued the moments she felt a little less steady in his absence. One night, week's work done, Fu stayed at the office later than usual. They sat across the scattered prints of manifests, and for a moment the city outside the window sounded like an indifferent audience. He leaned forward and said, without commentary, "You are getting better at this." The compliment had the dangerous softness of approval. Wanjo felt it as if it were a currency deposited to her private account. She smiled, the way a person smiles when receiving a valuation they have always wanted. Then she remembered Xiaoyan's photograph and the locket, and the cost of being valuable in an arena built on optics. She tucked the promise of that smile into the drawer next to the receipt and closed it. By the end of the weeks that tilted into months, Wanjo had traded parts of the life she had known for an apprenticeship in facts. She learned to see the city as paper and water in equal parts. The sea carried things that could be accounted for, and the city kept records of where they landed.
She moved through both worlds with growing facility. Sometimes she felt like a diver who had learned to hold her breath for longer and longer, until the surface seemed like a less urgent necessity. But the adoption of new skills never unmade the old pains. Memory of the photograph persisted like an underskin ache, vivid, unerasable. The locket's photograph of Xiaoyan sat in the drawer like a secret ledger that could not be reconciled with the public's ledger of her infamy. She would, with each receipt she filed and each witness she interviewed, be answering both ledgers at once, proving facts to strangers while nursing the private arithmetic of loss.
The first part of her reckoning ended not with a single note, but with an accumulation. Receipts, a man who offered steadiness, a card from Uncle Lee that opened a door, and a mirror that had hidden evidence in its seam. She had a strategy, she had allies, she had danger, and she had a new kind of hunger that was not shame and not merely power, but an ache for validation that might, over time, ask payment in ways she could not yet foresee. When she left the office that night, the river looked as she had seen it on the first evening after exile, indifferent, bearing a reflection that was only sometimes her own. She tucked the port receipt into the locket for the first time and walked through the city with the small, peculiar feeling that she had finally put a foot on a ladder rung. The climb would be long, the ladder might wobble. The photograph that had unmade her would remain in the world, but there were other instruments now, ledgers, subpoenas, manifests, that could be used not to erase a photograph, but to outlast it. She kept the receipt folded against her ribs, the way one keeps a secret prayer. For weeks the paper lived in the locket's hollow, like another pulse. Her life narrowed around that proof, and the rhythms Fru set for her. Come at 9, review the chain at noon, sit through a cluster of interviews in the afternoon. The days took on the methodical quality of counting. There was solace in the arithmetic. There was, too, an accumulating dependence that she began to recognize with a private, uneasy clarity. Their early operations were incremental and precise. Chi-Chi taught Wanjo how to read discrepancies at a glance, a manifest with a shifted serial, an invoice with a date misread as a decimal. Young taught her how to ask a clerk a question that sounded like curiosity and opened like a wedge. They executed a series of small, legal pressures. A supplier was asked to confirm delivery dates. A port terminal was asked to recheck unloading logs. A trade journal received an anonymous note about an unresolved supply chain irregularity. Each action was modest, bureaucratic, and orchestrated to force the Mangsu network to respond in the only language it usually spoke, paper and procedure. The first visible effect was not on a headline but on a balance sheet. One of the conglomerate's secondary importers, an outfit that serviced boutique hotels, missed a replenishment deadline, then another. The small vendor's phone calls went unanswered. Its owner, a woman named Layla, found herself taking out loans to cover a gap she could not explain, and her teenage son stayed home from school to help stack boxes. Wanjo met Layla once, in the hallway outside a terminal, and saw in the woman's lined face what the ledger could mean for ordinary people. Guilt surfed up against strategy. Wanjo's victories, she learned, would not be clean. Consequences would ripple through the city like the fairy wakes she had watched from her window.
That complexity sat with her while the dossier thickened. Pierce Hargrave proved more useful than anyone had hoped. He had been an accountant, then a middle manager, then an ex-insider who had grown tired of watching the same receipts shuffle through shelves. He arrived with email headers, scanned copies of bills of lading, and a memory like a calendar. His testimony would be fragile in court. He, like every person with knowledge, could be coerced or silenced, but his papers traced a route, a set of shipments ostensibly consigned to legitimate buyers that ended up in a warehouse linked through a chain of shell addresses to the Su family's logistical arm. For the first time, Wanjo felt that her work might not be merely ornamental. She watched Pierce explain, without affectation, how a container could be coded to a different consignee and later rerouted on paper. She traced the routes on a map until the lines resembled veins. The old master's name appeared as the sponsor on at least one document. It was not enough to indict, but it was a hinge. Fu, always economical with praise, said one sentence after Pierce's first delivery: "This is cloth, not flame." He meant that facts could smolder quietly until enough of them together would combust into a formal inquiry. His steadiness made Wanjo both braver and smaller.
She wanted him to look at her with approval, the way a child wants a teacher's nod. Approval became subtly and terrifically a currency. They moved the dossier into legal channels with careful choreography. Chi-Chi prepared exhibits. Young coordinated the court testimony. Uncle Lee provided contact names at the Trade Commission who could accept a confidential submission. The commission's procedure was slow and patient by design. An investigator would be assigned. Subpoenas might be issued to verify custody chains. Preliminary interviews could take months. Wanjo learned to read delay as a tactic and a refuge. The law did not race to spectacle. It built in room for cross-examination. When the first subpoena arrived for a warehouse manifest, the Old Masters Network reacted as networks do, with containment. Counsel for the Sioux House filed motions questioning jurisdiction and demanding production under terms likely to blur the trail. Threats arrived as letters and not as fists. Lawyers wrote denials that read like weather reports, cold, grammatical, intended to reassure shareholders. There was legal pressure. There were reputational countermoves, quiet messages to trade partners reminding them of the Sioux House's standing, a discreet dinner with editors. The old master did not fight with the fury of one who was surprised. He answered as someone accustomed to accounting for storms. On a drizzling morning, Fu and Wanjo stood on the commission's tiled steps and watched a small group of journalists scratch notes and photograph the suitcases entering the building. Wanjo felt exposed in a new way.
The photograph that had first undone her had been taken in a flash. Here the cameras were patient, recording slow people moving through bureaucracy. She felt them looking for a reveal, for the drama tabloids were built to sell. She wanted, fiercely, the hearing to be about facts and not about her face. In the days leading to the preliminary hearing, the family's defensive apparatus shifted from polished denial to a strategy of attrition. They filed counterclaims and hired counsel who specialized not only in litigation, but in delay. Shareholders whispered in private calls. The Mang family, particularly Mang Shao, began to wobble in public posture. A company statement that had once been scripted in tones of certainty now read like a careful, non-committal afterthought. The balance that had seemed total in the yacht's lights was cracking, and the ledger-making Wanjo had learned to love revealed the fissure. Her personal life, by contrast, collapsed inward. She began to measure her days in his messages, one sentence at dawn, another in the afternoon with a list of items to check. She checked the phone the way a person in a long drought might watch the weather app. There were small comforts, an extra hour in the office to untangle a manifest, a hand that steadied the back of a chair, but also small concessions. She canceled an invitation from a distant cousin because Fu had an unexpected meeting and she did not want to be out of reach. She deferred a conversation about her mother's postcard because she was in the middle of a deposition. She told herself these were reasonable sacrifices for the cause. Then she noticed she began to misname reasons for decision, as if logic alone justified proximity. The dependency emerged in understated behaviors. She waited for his approval before sending a list. She felt a particular sting when his replies came brusque. She arranged her calendar around his availability. One evening, after a late review, she found that she had unconsciously rewritten a brief to align with a nuance he had suggested earlier, not because it altered the facts, but because his phrasing comforted her. The realization felt like a misfiled receipt. Something had slipped out of place, and the ledger of her autonomy registered the error. An escalation followed. An envelope arrived that did not fit the tone of legal letters. It was thicker, unmarked, and contained a single printed photograph, two bodies at a dinner table, captured at a vantage that provided no context. It was not salacious. It was a simple, clear image of complicity. Someone had been watching, and the photograph bore the patient cruelty of a camera that waits for an unguarded second. A note folded under the photograph read, in plain typescript, "If the commission finds this inconvenient, we will make it inconvenient everywhere." The blackmail probe was a test of their collective nerve. Wanjo took the photograph to Chi-Chi first, then to Young, and finally to Fu. He did not flinch.
He slid the photograph back into the envelope with an economy that made her grateful and panicked at the same time. "This is the cost of being visible," he said. "It does not change the facts." "It changes everything," Wanjo allowed. "It makes my choices look personal." Fu's response was practical. "Then make sure the matter is resolved on points that cannot be doubted. Facts are the only defense that cannot be weaponized by gossip." But the photograph had already done its work. Newsrooms sniffed around the margins, trade watchers speculated, and somebody in the old master's orbit began to plant stories about Wanjo's motives. The coupling of Wanjo with Fu, once a discrete matter of companionship and aid, became a line to be drawn by enemies who understood optics as well as ledgers. The risk was not only reputational, it was strategic.
If the family could cast the inquiry as a personal vendetta masked as regulatory scrutiny, they might blunt the commission's appetite. The first day of the preliminary hearing arrived like a trial of patience. The room smelled of coffee and paper. Fluorescent lights carved lines across faces. The commission's counsel asked for a reading of the manifest chain. Wanjo sat in the back row, hands folded around the locket until the metal warmed under her fingers. Her testimony was scheduled as supportive, not central, but she watched every witness and how counsel pried at their memories. Pierce Hargrave took the stand like a man walking across a thin ice. He spoke calmly about the emails and the invoices. Under oath, the found details took on a statelier truth. The old master's counsel tried to falter Pierce's memory, to make small inconsistencies seem monstrous. Young, from the back, watched the cross with the same patient eye he used on port registries. Chi-Chi clutched a slim file and looked as if she might keep it safe in her lap forever. When Wanjo was called, she felt the room's attention tilt toward her the way a lighthouse's beam finds the shore. She was not asked to produce the receipt from behind the mirror. That piece of paper was evidence for the counsel to present when the time came, but she was asked about the circumstances around her discovery and about the steps she had taken thereafter. She answered with the clear economy she had learned: dates, places, the chain of contacts. She felt each sentence weigh the ledger and the photograph against each other. During cross-examination, the old master's counsel tried to scent motive. He framed questions to make her appear vindictive. Did she not resent being exiled? Had she not wanted revenge? Wanjo felt the old ache, her grief for Shawan, the sting of being visible in one false light. She had practiced speaking about pain as an aside, not the meat of a defense. She kept her emotions thinly docked from the answers, as if tears might be cited as motive. Her voice stayed steady.
In the margin of her mind, she catalogued another small truth: that her steadiness had become an argument. Fu watched from the public gallery with the same composed face he wore in a conference room. He did not move when counsel raised the specter of impropriety, but his hands were folded so hard his knuckles went white for a moment. Wanjim noticed and felt both protected and somehow diminished. She wanted to turn and look at him, to say the thing she had not yet found the courage to say in private, but the room demanded a different kind of fidelity, truth to facts, not pleas for private devotion. The hearing adjourned for a recess, and the room emptied with the mechanical civility of a train platform after a signal halts. The reporters murmured, the counsel packed up exhibits, and the commissioners paced in a small cluster. Wanjo met Fu outside the hearing room, the corridor a place where the building's harsh light cut through the soft expectations they had built. "You were clear," he said. "You looked like you wanted to stand up," she replied. Her voice held reprimand and gratitude in the same note. "You didn't." He smiled without mockery. "You did well. They cannot make facts from rumors. They can smear us, but they cannot alter the manifests." "You didn't tell them about your contact at the terminal," she said, the sentence landing as an accusation. "You could have. Pierce could have." "I kept that channel closed because it was exploitable," Fu said. "You would have lost a witness to process. He would have been subpoenaed, yet intimidated. I am preserving what we need." The exchange that followed was small and telling. Wanjo realized she had been expecting him to take a risk for her, as if that risk were in itself proof of devotion. Instead, he took risks in measured and administrative ways. His restraint was not an absence of feeling. It was a consistent strategy that sometimes made her feel both cared for and kept at a distance. The ache returned, this time not only grief but the clutch of longing for the warmth he offered, and the control that warmth imported. Outside, the press reported the hearing as the commission opened an inquiry. Headlines hedged. Some framed Wanjo as persistent, others continued the narrative of a social drama. The old master's legal team filed motions designed to deplete resources. The city continued to turn, indifferent and attentive in turns. When the commission issued a finding of probable cause weeks later, it read like a partial verdict in a ledger that refused to balance. The phrase itself, probable cause, was legalistic and cautious. It would not put the old master behind bars. It would, however, open the door to further inquiry, compel testimonies, and allow subpoenas to pierce safe silos. Shareholders reacted like people who hear a rumor and walk toward the emergency exit. Stock tickers shivered. Suppliers pleaded for certainty. For Wanjo, the commission's decision tasted like a victory with an aftertaste. Yet the victory had already been bought by costs she could not neatly sum. Employees at a logistics firm had been laid off after a major client suspended orders at the commission's request. Lila's debts deepened. A supplier in the outer district closed, citing the uncertainty that the inquiry had brought upon trade. Wanjo learned the ledger's other side. Power redistributed is always felt by someone who had not expected to carry the weight. Meanwhile, the old master's counsels redoubled counterattacks. A discreet legal notice was sent to a journalist questioning whether sources had been paid. A shareholder threatened to sue for destabilization. An online network began dredging up old photographs, looking for images that could be reinterpreted. The blackmail photograph in particular had metastasized into rumors that Fu was manipulating Wanjo for leverage. Some columnists frame their relationship as strategic rather than sincere, a gambit meant to make her appear compromised. The men who had once called the tune of her social calendar now scripted her motives. The personal cost became acute when a private message, leaked to a tabloid, suggested that Fu and Wanjo had met on neutral financial terms only to weaponize a family's downfall. The article was careful with facts but abundant in insinuation. Wanjo watched the piece as if she were watching her own name in an archival search. The world was inventing a portrait that fused her grief into scheming. She felt small and historically legible, as if someone had catalogued her decay. That evening she found on her apartment table another envelope, an older photograph this time, folded and creased. It was of Xiaowan, taken in summer, the child's smile a counterpoint to the city's hard angles. The note accompanying it read, "You cannot have one without the other. Be careful how you count." Wanjo sat with the photograph and the note. The ledger had taught her to count, and the blackmail taught her the politics of counting aloud. The choice presented itself like a theorem. Public exposure could delegitimize the inquiry. Concealment could let a malign pattern persist. The question was not legal only. It was moral and private. Should she sacrifice the privacy of two people for a chance to break an apparatus that moved goods and influence with impunity? The more the commission pressed, the more she found herself smoothing the rough edges of their operation so that emotion did not leak into procedure. At times she withheld a fragment of information that might have implicated acquaintances of Fu's who were tangential partners in legitimate deals. Her relation with Fu had made her increasingly protective of him. That protectiveness began to shade choices. She rationalized that keeping certain ties intact made strategic sense, but the ledger of conscience recorded the omission. Fu, on his part, was not untroubled by the charge that the partnership was strategic.
He resented the tabloid's insinuations, but seemed to measure his response in terms of runway, how to keep the operation moving without exposing individual vulnerabilities. Once, late into a rain-softened night, he said to Wanjo, with a softness that masqueraded as calculation, "We have to think 2 steps ahead, not only of them, but of the people who stand behind them who can be harmed by our haste." His words were a plea he wrapped in reason. Wanjo heard again the harbor tone she had once equated with care, but she also felt the nails of obligation begin to enter wood. Being protective for him now felt as much like protecting an idea, his idea of patient, legalized correction, as it did protecting a person. Was she keeping him safe, or was she keeping herself tethered to a provider of solace? The hinge, the crucial presentation, arrived in a commission chamber whose low, rectangular windows trapped the city's gray. The panel asked for documentation connecting a shipment to a warehouse whose bill of lading bore the old master's signature. Chi-Chi had prepared the exhibit. Young had corroborated the chain. Pierce had committed to testify to the transfer of certain invoices. Wanjo watched as the paper trail presented itself. Pages that had once seemed dull became a kind of accusation. She felt an odd reverence for them, as if the sheets were sacramental. When the warehouse receipt, retrieved from an official archive after a subpoena, was read into record, Wanjo's stomach tightened. The receipt had the old master's name. It had the date and the manifest number. It connected, in the commission's slow arithmetic, to an irregular routing Pierce had described. The room registered the linkage with the muted sound of a curtain moving. It did not snap, but it disclosed. Cross-examination was relentless. The old master's counsel sought to unpick chain links, to show that paperwork can be forged, that shipping numbers are fluid. The commission's counsel answered with documents authenticated by clerks, with logging times and port operator confirmations. The hearing did not end in triumph. It ended in more subpoenas, in the slow unspooling of the bureaucracy that might, in time, bring accountability. It was, in essence and in law, a partial victory. Probable cause had moved into formal inquiry. After the hearing adjourned, Wanjo felt relief and a peculiar emptiness. The victory was not the kind she could display at a luncheon. It was the work of heavy desks, of a clerk's signature, and of patient, tedious proof. It had the flavor of coal rather than champagne. The commission's step made it possible that some of the wrongs might be addressed, but it did not guarantee restitution. It did not console Xiaowan. It only armed the city with enough questions to make the old master's posture wobble. That night, as they stood alone in the office where their operation had once begun, Fu unbuttoned his cuff and, without explanation, reached for her hand.
His gesture was minimal, an absent-minded smoothing of skin, but it landed like an offer. Wanjo allowed herself for a second to accept it, to lean into the warmth and steady geometry he represented. She felt in that clasp both refuge and a small loss of independence. He steadied her, but the steadiness felt like a lever that required her to operate it and become, in the operation itself, dependent. "Do you regret the risk?" he asked quietly. "What do you mean?" she replied. "The way the campaign has blurred lines," he said. "The way it has put the private into public. Are you—" She did not answer with a single word of regret. She answered with the truth she could not afford to lose. "I want the truth named." "And if naming the truth names us as well?" he asked. He asked the question as if to let her know the price. Wanjo felt the ledger's ink, damp and new, on her fingers. She thought of Shawan's laugh and the photograph in the drawer. At some point, grief asks a calculus. What are you willing to lose to be vindicated? Her hand tightened around his. "I am willing," she said. The sentence felt both declarative and incomplete. Over the following months, the process slowed into a rhythm of hearings and quiet negotiations. Witnesses were deposed, access to emails was ordered, and the old master's lawyers kept launching motions. The city watched and speculated. Shareholders shifted their stances based on the tide of worry that the commission's inquiry produced. The old master, once an unassailable ledger of influence, found his name penciled beside questions. Wanjo's dependence became more visible to herself with each small concession. She allowed a meeting to be scheduled at Fu's private office rather than a neutral room. It was faster, and she liked the comfort of the surroundings. She edited a statement with his counsel's phrasing to give it a legal precision he applauded. She declined a friend's dinner because someone important to Fu could only be met that night. She told herself each choice served the operation. She began to confuse the operation's needs with his presence. The distinction blurred. If a ledger balances on both sides equally, hers had begun to tilt. Then the inevitable counterattack arrived in the form of a strategic disclosure. The old master's team leaked an internal memo, old, dry, but suggestive, that a supplier had reported unexplained diversions. The memo did not prove malfeasance. It suggested an internal audit had previously noticed irregularities and chosen not to publish them. The leak's intention was clear: frame the commission's inquiry as opportunistic and the complainant as mercenary. The narrative it begged was that Wanjo, with Fu at her side, had capitalized on an open door. The leak shifted attention from pure procedural detail to character. Commentators who had previously been indifferent suddenly cared about motive. Wanjo felt old scars tear in public. The demand to be seen as sincere, not vengeful, became paramount. She resented that she had to perform sincerity when sincerity was private and irreducible. The pressure mounted and the blackmail intensified. A second envelope, this one containing a carefully assembled dossier of their meetings, photographs of private dinners, and an innocuous note of warning, was left under the cafe's salt-stained menu where Uncle Lee had once placed his card. Someone in the city's network had eyes into their small acts. Wanjo suspected the family had deep reach. She suspected, too, that her closeness to Fu made her vulnerable in ways she had not anticipated. "What would you rather have done?" she asked him one night, after the leak had pushed a columnist to write a piece suggesting the inquiry was motivated by revenge. He regarded her for a long time, as if weighing not only legal strategy, but the human cost. Finally, he said, "I would have preferred evidence to speak for itself. But I know we do not live in a country of self-evident truths. We live in a country of narratives that must be managed." "Do you ever think that we are managing each other's narratives at the cost of truth?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression Wanjo had come to both crave and mistrust. "I think," he said slowly, "that we are making choices in a dangerous place. Some of those choices are pragmatic. Some of them are moral. We will have to live with both." It was an answer without absolution. It left room for their continued partnership and for the choices that would follow. Wanjo held on to that ambivalence like a ledger that had not yet closed. At the Commission's next public session, Pierce Hargrave gave a fuller account of the routing. He read email headers aloud. The clerks confirmed dates. The hearing's air felt thin,
like the space in a sail when a wind finally fills it. The commission moved to recommend further investigation into the Sioux family's logistics division. The recommendation did not convict, but it opened prosecutorial windows. The old master's public persona shuddered in ways the ledger could hardly conceal. In the aftermath, some shareholders began to distance themselves, not out of indignation, but out of fear. The market is an elegant animal. It responds not to morality, but to the prediction of liability. The commission's recommendation made the old ledger, built from decades, feel squat under a new weight. Wanjo drove back from the hearing in a small hush with Fu in the passenger seat. The city was wet with rain that reasserted its indifference. She felt patient exhaustion and a private elation that matched the complexity of her losses. The victory was not complete. The old master retained resources and had long memories. The inquiry meant years more of legal skirmishes and expense. It meant uncertainty, but it also meant the possibility of accountability that was procedural and not merely rhetorical.
That night, a new challenge arrived. A call from Layla, the small vendor whose business had staggered when orders delayed. "They have closed my account," she said with quiet resignation. "I cannot pay my suppliers. My son is looking for work." Wanjo listened and felt the ledger in her chest ache. Here was proof that their campaign had consequences beyond the walls of power. She had told herself that the law must be used to correct systems that harm, but she had not anticipated the collateral cost to people who had no power to shape the narrative. She called Chi-Chi and arranged for an emergency fund to cover Layla's suppliers until the inquiry resolved the supply chain irregularity. It was the right thing to do and also a small, personal reparation for the choices that had rippled outward. Each such act, help, correction, quiet restitution, functioned as a counterbalance in her private ledger. She needed to be able to live with the consequences of her strategy. The law could do some of the heavy lifting, but the human cost required hands that were willing to stay dirty. As winter edged toward the year's end, the old master retreated from public appearances. He stopped attending board meetings and issued a terse statement that he would cooperate with the investigation. He had not admitted wrongdoing. He had only accepted a posture of compliance. For Wanjo, this was both a cover and an admission. Power does not need to confess to be effective. Sometimes absence is the more forceful statement. Fu and Wanjo's relationship deepened into a cadence both comforting and constraining. They shared more private evenings in minor before-dawn cafes where they would read manifests like lovers read letters. They talked about small things, a clerk's odd phrasing, the weather at a terminal, a strange delay at a railroad yard. They avoided declarations, not because they lacked feeling, but because words risked being evidence in an adversarial world. Their intimacy was a litany of shared tasks, proof sheets, phone trees, the names of clerks who could be trusted. It was practical, efficient, and in its efficiency, it became addictive. Wanjo began to crave the routine of being close to him in the way one might crave a particular kind of weather. She noticed, with a mounting self-awareness, behaviors that registered dependence. She found it difficult to refuse his suggestions even when they veered into the ethical gray. She woke at odd hours waiting for a message from him and felt a prick of panic when replies were delayed. She edited her own notes to reflect his phrasing. She valued his approval more than she valued the satisfaction of an independent observation. At times, she lied to herself that her closeness was advantage, not cost. One night, a courier arrived with a small black card. On it was printed in a neat financial font, "Do not stop." The note read, "You have two choices. Cede the field and accept certain privacy, or continue and accept the necessary losses.
Choose if you must." Someone was offering counsel from a safe distance. The ambiguity itself was a kind of pressure. Wanjo placed the card next to Xiaoan's photograph and felt a ledger open in a way that was not counting goods, but counting debts of the heart. What would she be willing to sacrifice in order to press this inquiry to an outcome? She thought of Layla, of the port clerks who had lost work, of the employees laid off because of panicked clients, and of her own hunger to be more than a photograph. Each answer she offered the world entailed a cost someone else might pay. The story never had a clean ending. The commission's inquiry developed into layered investigations. Subpoenas produced memos, which produced interviews, which produced more subpoenas. The old master settled some matters quietly, paid certain vendors with confidentiality agreements, and withdrew from the most public forums. But the suggestion of impropriety persisted in a way that altered his legacy. For Wanjo, this was a victory complicated by the reality that a ledger, once opened, does not return neatly to blank. The personal ledger remained unsettled. The more Wanjo invested in the campaign and in Fu,
the more she felt the gravitational pull of his presence. She began to accept that her motives were composite: grief, a sense of violated dignity, the hunger for agency, and a genuine affection for the constancy he offered. The distinctions mattered, but they were no longer available to neat separation. In the weeks after the Commission's procedural finding, the old master's influence diminished in small, measurable ways. Board appointments were reviewed. A subsidiary contract was rescinded. One of the family's favored suppliers faced an inquiry. Wanjo watched the adjustments with a complex satisfaction. The society that had once turned on her photograph now had to parse the ledger, and parsing demanded resources the family could no longer expel without cost. But the balance sheet of consequence read on both sides. Wanjo received an anonymous tip that some of the documents she had relied upon were sabotaged and attempted counter-forgery. The Commission opened a parallel inquiry into potential tampering. Suddenly, the careful work she and her team had done was itself under scrutiny. It was a risk inherent in turning evidence into instrument. You make facts speak, others may attempt to make them scream. She confronted the fear with method. They rechecked chain of custody. Young found a clerk who could testify to the document's integrity. Chi-Chi filed an affidavit about how the exhibits had been kept. The Commission accepted the corrections and did not dismiss their evidence, but the episode left Wanjo shaken. She had felt for a time that the ledger was a place of safety. Now she understood it as a contested terrain where both truth and manipulation lived. In the quiet aftermath, she began to imagine a life not defined by the inquiry.
She dreamt of small things, a room with simple light where she could leave the locket on a mantel and not think of chain of custody. She imagined a year where the city was softer with her. But desire has a way of complicating hope. Fu's presence had become a rhythm she knew. His messages, the small practical solaces, the photograph of Shawan folded into the locket and warm against her palm. The city was the color of weathered brass. She watched water move with a pace that neither hurried nor paused. The sea had been calm the night the photograph was taken. Now the river bore on it the memory of months of work. Fu found her there when she had almost finished counting the small fissures in her own ledger. He did not speak at first. He sat beside her and traced the phrase of her name as if it were a tablet he needed to remember. When he finally did speak, it was about simple things: the clerk who had turned up a late receipt, the nameless woman Layla who now had a gap in her supply chain. "You are tired," he said. "You think?" She offered the jest as a kind of armor, then let silence shape itself around her. "Do you regret—" she began, and stopped. Her question was a litmus she did not trust to answer aloud. He did not finish it for her. Instead, he took her hand, a gentle, unassuming clasp, and for a moment the world compressed into the steady friction of skin. Wanjo felt the ledger tilt. She thought of the photograph in the locket, and the receipt behind the mirror, and the Commission's stodgy, imperfect machinery. She thought of how desire had begun as refuge, and had come, without fanfare, to feel like requirement. "Whatever happens," Fu said, "we will handle it." The promise was insufficient, and also impossible to refuse. It felt like the crux of her new life, part partnership, part enslavement. She thought of the river and the way water does not hold shape, but holds passage. She thought that perhaps they were both travelers and anchors to one another. The Commission's inquiry stretched into months, and the city adjusted to the polling of a new reality. Some allies grew distant under pressure. Uncle Lee retreated into an instructive silence, offering advice only when necessary. Piers Hargrave faded into anonymity after his testimony, protected by process, but not immune to the loneliness of a whistleblower. Layla's small store reopened with help the team had arranged. Her son returned to school. Wanjo found small consolations in these repairs. There was no cinematic moment of collapse or triumph. The old master maintained his dignity, but with a diminished voice. The Mang family negotiated quietly to maintain assets. The society that had once cast Wanjo into exile now watched the slow, tedious unmasking with a new kind of attentiveness. The ledger had done what cameras could not. It had forced the city, in small measures, to admit discrepancies. Wanjo received offers to return to certain social functions. Invitations arrived like little trials, a charity luncheon, a gallery opening. She declined most. She had learned that the camera's flash could never be fully trusted. The ledger's patience had taught her to prefer slow justice to spectacle. Yet at times she wondered whether the price she had paid, the friendships cooled, the personal compromises made, had been worth it. She loved Fu in a way that was complicated and not easily named. At times the affection felt like freedom,
a harbor that did not judge the sea's shape. At other times, it felt like a subtle addiction, a steadying that required repeated consumption. She recognized that dependencies develop when one relies on another's steadiness to manage an internal flinch. Her attachment to him had allowed her to move forward, but also had quietly taken from her the ability to be alone in decision. The commission's final public motion, only a step, not a verdict, left the old master politically diminished and legally vulnerable to further inquiry. The city asked for an accounting. Wanjo felt weary and relieved, and the ledger of the world had been slightly rebalanced. She had, with slow patience, made a system answerable. The cost was counted not only in the old master's shaken posture, but in the small lives that had been disrupted along the way, and in the private shift of her own inner accounts. At the story's edge, Wanjo stood in her apartment with the locket open, Shawan's smile folded inside, and the port receipt slid beside it like a margin note. Papers from the commission lay in a neat pile on the coffee table. She had won the leverage she sought, in that the state apparatus had begun an investigation, but she had not written a final chapter in the family's undoing. Legal processes are not curtains drawn closed. They are the slow closing of doors that creak and then settle. Fu came in without preamble and sat beside her. She did not know if the man who steadied her was a savior or a chain. Possibly he was both. Neither would be the whole truth. He leaned forward, placed a hand gently, familiarly over hers on the locket and receipt. There was a tenderness in the smallness of the gesture. It was the map of a relationship that had become a mechanism, and the mechanism had become their method of survival. "Where do we go from here?" she asked him. He did not answer with an easy map. "We keep doing the work. We protect what we must. We make choices we can live with." Wanjo let the ambiguity sit between them. She closed the locket and slid the receipt back into its pocket, returning things to their small, cramped order. The sea beyond the city still moved in indifferent curlicues. The photograph that had once been her undoing remained folded in a drawer.
The ledger was open and would continue to be open. The commission had turned a photograph into a slow, patient process. She imagined a life that might someday be less bound to other people's attentions. A life with room for a small, steady grief to exist, without the need for vindication. She imagined also the kind of courage it would take to break the quiet loop of dependence for the sake of being true to herself. Fu's hand remained over hers, neither pressing nor withdrawing. Wanjo realized the future would require her to read ledgers not only of commerce, but of the self. She had traded spectacle for evidence, and in the bargain had bought a complicated constancy that warmed and constrained in equal measure. When she rose at last, she carried the locket to the drawer and placed Shaoan's photograph beneath a stack of neutral paper, neither hidden in shame nor displayed for the city's scrutiny. She left the receipt where it belonged, as evidence of a path she had chosen. She stood by the window and watched the river make its quiet passage. Fu stepped close, and without thinking, she took his hand. It was a small, human gesture, neither answer nor question. The ledger would continue to require balancing. The legal work would continue. Hearings and motions would trail into the future like small, patient eddies. Wanjo had made herself an author of consequence, and had discovered that authorship could also cost more than one expected. If you were in her place, faced with the choice between protecting a private wound and exposing a public wrong, what would you choose? Would you protect privacy or pursue truth, even when the price could be your own heart? If this slow burn story held you, share what you would do in the comments, and subscribe for more long-form tales of power, loss, and the fragile arithmetic of justice.